A crisp autumn breeze rustled through Springfield's maple-lined streets as James Marshall guided his 2015 Honda Accord around a familiar corner. The weathered sit-in, its navy paint showing signs of age and wisdom much like its owner, hummed quietly as Miles Davis's "Kind of Blue" drifted from the speakers. This was his sanctuary, the one place where he could shed the weight of his upcoming responsibilities and simply be himself. At 52, Marshall had deliberately chosen to drive his personal car today instead of the gleaming black SUV that awaited him at the state capitol. Today wasn't about Colonel James Marshall, the decorated officer who'd just been appointed as the state's first black police chief. Today was about being Jimmy, the son who never missed his mama's Sunday dinner, no matter how high he climbed in life. The small medallion of honor, awarded for saving 3 children from a hostage situation a decade ago, swayed gently from his rearview mirror. He kept it there not as a boast, but as a reminder of why he joined the force in the first place: to protect and serve, regardless of who needed protecting or serving. His mother, Catherine, had called him twice already this morning, fretting about whether he'd remember to pick up the fresh okra for her legendary gumbo. "Jimmy," she'd said in that tone that made him feel like he was still 10 years old, "you know your father always said a Sunday dinner without okra is like a church without prayers." The memory of his father's words brought a warm smile to his face. Robert Marshall had served on the same police force for 30 years, facing discrimination with unwavering dignity until the day he retired. As Marshall approached the intersection of Maple and 5th, where Miss Eleanor Jenkins, his mother's best friend since college, kept watch over the neighborhood from her wraparound porch, he noticed a patrol car idling near the stop sign. He came to a complete stop, just as he'd done thousands of times before, but something in his gut told him this Sunday morning was about to take an unexpected turn. The patrol car's lights flickered to life in his rearview mirror. Marshall checked his speedometer reflexively, 23 in a 25 zone. His stop had been textbook perfect. He'd even used his turn signal despite the empty streets. 28 years of law enforcement experience told him this wasn't about traffic violations. Officers Thompson and Rivera had been working this beat for less than a year. Marshall knew this because he'd reviewed all recent personnel assignments in preparation for his new role, though he purposely avoided meeting any officers in person. He believed in seeing his department in action, unfiltered and honest, before making any major changes. Through his mirror, Marshall watched the 2 officers exchange knowing looks as they ran his plates. He could read their body language like a book, the subtle smirks, the relaxed shoulders that suggested they thought this would be a routine stop, the kind they'd done countless times before. They couldn't see the 3 advanced degrees hanging in his home office, or the key to the city he'd received last month, or the speech about police reform sitting half-finished on his desk. Marshall turned down Miles Davis and reached for his registration with practiced calm. His father's voice echoed in his memory. "Son, when they pull you over, and they will pull you over, remember that your dignity is not up for debate. Let them show who they are, and you show who you've become." The morning sun caught his mother's gold cross necklace, which he borrowed last week to have cleaned for her birthday. It lay on the passenger seat, another reminder of the family legacy he carried. As the officers approached his car, Marshall took a deep breath and straightened his posture. This moment, he realized, would either become another painful reminder of how far they still had to go, or an opportunity to bridge a gap that had existed for far too long. He rolled down his window, keeping both hands visible on the steering wheel, just as he taught countless cadets to do during traffic stops. The irony wasn't lost on him. Officers Thompson and Rivera emerged from their patrol car with the practiced swagger of men who'd grown too comfortable with their authority. Thompson, a stocky veteran with 7 years on the force, led the approach while Rivera, barely 2 years out of the academy, flanked the passenger side with his hand resting casually on his holster. Well, what do we have here?" Thompson's drawl carried an edge of manufactured authority as he aimed his flashlight directly into Marshall's eyes, despite the morning sun providing more than enough visibility. The beam lingered intentionally long, a small but deliberate act of dominance that Marshall had seen countless times before, and had specifically addressed in training seminars he conducted. "Good morning, officers," Marshall responded, his voice carrying the kind of measured calm that came from decades of experience on both sides of the badge. He noticed Thompson's body camera's indicator light was dark, a detail that would normally escape the average citizen's attention. "You always roll through stop signs in this neighborhood," Rivera chimed in, his tone carrying that particular mix of accusation and amusement that made Marshall's stomach tighten. The young officer was mirroring his senior partner's behavior, a phenomenon Marshall had studied extensively during his tenure as a police psychologist. A child on a bright red bicycle stopped at the corner, his wide eyes taking in the scene. Marshall recognized him as Marcus, Miss Eleanor's grandson, who'd recently won the local science fair. The boy's presence added another layer of weight to the moment. Another young black child witnessing what had become an all-too-familiar scene. "I came to a complete stop, officer," Marshall stated calmly, his words precise and measured. Thompson and Rivera exchanged glances, the kind that carried unspoken commentary about Marshall's articulate speech. "Oh, did you hear that, Rivera?" Thompson's voice dripped with mockery as he affected an exaggerated formal tone. The gentleman came to a complete stop. He drew out the words like he was performing for an audience, which, unknowingly, he increasingly was. Residents had begun to appear on their porches, phones quietly recording the interaction. Rivera played along, adopting the same mocking tone. Indeed, Thompson, quite eloquent for this time of morning. The officers shared a chuckle, their laughter carrying across the quiet street like a challenge. Marshall noticed Mrs. Davidson, his former high school English teacher, watching from her garden, her pruning shears frozen mid-cut. Her presence transported him briefly to her classroom, where she'd once taught him about Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from Birmingham jail. Sometimes, she'd said, dignity is the most powerful form of defiance. "License and registration," Thompson demanded, deliberately dropping the please that department policy required. Marshall moved with deliberate slowness, narrating his actions just as he taught his officers to allow civilians to do. "I'm reaching for my registration from the glove compartment, officer." "Just hurry it up," Rivera snapped, his hand still hovering near his weapon. The young officer's nervous energy betrayed his insecurity, a dangerous combination with authority that Marshall had written about in his doctoral thesis on police psychology. As Marshall retrieved his documents, he caught a glimpse of Miss Eleanor on her porch, her hand covering her mouth in recognition. She'd been at his promotion ceremony just last week, beaming with pride as the governor announced his appointment. Now she stood witness to this moment of stark irony, her phone steady in her hands as she documented everything. Thompson snatched the registration with unnecessary force, studying it with exaggerated scrutiny. "A 2015 Honda, huh? Seems a bit nice for." He let the implication hang in the air. Another textbook example of the subtle harassment Marshall had spent years documenting and fighting against. The growing audience of neighbors created an almost theatrical atmosphere, with the officers remaining oblivious to their expanding viewership. A mail carrier had stopped his route, frozen in place as he recognized the man behind the wheel. Two joggers slowed to a walk, their morning routine interrupted by the unfolding scene. Marshall remained still, his hands at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel, embodying the very instructions he'd given to his teenage son about handling police interactions. The irony of his current situation wasn't lost on him. How his extensive qualifications and eminent position meant nothing in the face of deeply ingrained prejudices. "Step out of the vehicle," Officer Rivera barked, his command carrying more bravado than authority. Marshall recognized the telltale signs of an officer manufacturing probable cause, something he'd specifically addressed in countless training sessions at the academy. With practiced composure, he reached for his phone, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. "Sir, I'd like to respectfully decline that request," Marshall responded, his voice carrying the weight of someone who taught constitutional law to police cadets for 15 years. Unless you can articulate reasonable suspicion of a crime, I'm not legally obligated to exit my vehicle." Thompson's face darkened at the challenge to his authority. His hand twitched toward his weapon, a gesture Marshall had analyzed in thousands of hours of body camera footage during his research on escalation patterns. "Oh, so now you're a lawyer too," he sneered, emphasizing lawyer like it was a slur. The morning sun cast long shadows across the street as more neighbors emerged from their homes. Mrs. Rodriguez, who'd served as a court interpreter for 3 decades, stood on her lawn with her morning coffee forgotten in her hand. She'd been a guest speaker at one of Marshall's seminars on community policing just last month. "Actually," Marshall began, his phone now recording, "I'm quite familiar with Terry v. Ohio and its implications for traffic stops." He noticed Rivera's eyes widen slightly at the legal reference, perhaps remembering it from his recent academy training that Marshall himself had helped design. Thompson leaned into the window, his breath fogging the glass. "Listen here, smart guy. What's someone like you doing in this neighborhood, anyway?" The question hung in the air, loaded with assumptions and prejudice. Behind him, Marcus, the boy on the bicycle, had been joined by his older sister Keisha, both watching with a mixture of fear and fascination. Marshall felt a familiar heaviness in his chest, not fear, but a deep weariness. The same weariness he'd seen in his father's eyes years ago when he'd come home after similar encounters. "I grew up in this neighborhood, Officer Thompson," he replied, noting how the use of the officer's name caused a flicker of surprise. "That blue house 3 doors down. That's where my mother still lives." Rivera snickered, exchanging a knowing look with his partner. "Right, and I suppose you're just heading over for Sunday dinner." The sarcasm in his voice was thick, unaware that he'd accidentally stumbled onto the truth. Through his side mirror, Marshall could see Miss Eleanor's live stream attracting viewers, the comment counter ticking up rapidly. Among the viewers, he recognized the avatars of several state officials who'd attended his confirmation hearing last week. The irony was almost painful. "Sir," Thompson's voice dripped with artificial patience, "your attitude is making us concerned for our safety." It was a classic escalation tactic, one Marshall had written about extensively in his paper on pretextual stops. "We're going to need you to step out of the vehicle now." Marshall kept his hands visible on the steering wheel, his father's old advice echoing in his mind. Sometimes the strongest move is staying still. The medallion on his rearview mirror caught the sunlight, sending a brief flash across Thompson's face. "Officers," Marshall began, his tone carrying the same authority he'd used in police briefings, "I want to ensure we're all clear about what's happening here. You've stopped me for allegedly rolling through a stop sign, though my dashcam will show I came to a complete stop. You've escalated a routine traffic stop without probable cause, and you're now attempting to manufacture reasonable suspicion for a vehicle search." The clinical breakdown of their tactics seemed to unsettle both officers. Rivera's hand dropped from his holster, and Thompson straightened up slightly, uncertainty creeping into his posture. "Furthermore," Marshall continued, "Officer Thompson's body camera appears to be malfunctioning, which department policy requires you to report immediately. And Officer Rivera, I notice you've positioned yourself in a way that blocks your own camera's view of this interaction." The growing crowd of onlookers had become completely still, the only sound the distant church bells marking the hour. Miss Eleanor's live stream counter now showed over 1,000 viewers, including, though the officers couldn't know it, the state attorney general and police commissioner. Marshall's phone buzzed in his hand, a call that would shatter the officer's illusion of control. But for now, he let the moment stretch, a living tableau of everything he'd spent his career working to change. From her wraparound porch, Mrs. Eleanor Jenkins gripped her phone with trembling hands, her morning devotional forgotten beside her rocking chair. Her live stream had exploded from a handful of local community watch members to over 2,000 viewers in mere minutes. As a retired civil rights attorney who'd fought similar battles in courtrooms for 4 decades, she recognized this moment's significance with crystal clarity. For those just joining, she narrated quietly into her phone, her voice carrying the gravitas of someone who'd witnessed too many similar scenes. "We're watching two officers harass Dr. James Marshall." Yes, the same James Marshall who's scheduled to be sworn in as our new state police chief next week. The comments section erupted with shocked emojis and angry reactions. The officers remained oblivious to their growing audience. Thompson had returned to his patrol car with Marshall's license, making a show of running it through the system. Eleanor watched as Rivera maintained his intimidating stance, hands still hovering near his weapon, unaware that his career was unraveling with every passing second. "Jimmy," Eleanor whispered to herself, using the name she'd called him since he was a boy racing his bicycle past her porch. "You've got them right where you want them." She recognized the patient strategy in Marshall's calm demeanor, the same approach he'd used when reforming 3 troubled precincts in his previous role. Among the viewers, Eleanor spotted familiar names: Judge Patricia Martinez, who'd mentored Marshall in law school, Captain Rodriguez from Internal Affairs, and even Senator Williams, who'd championed Marshall's appointment. The political implications of this stop were growing by the second, though Thompson and Rivera remained blissfully unaware of their audience. A comment popped up from the police commissioner himself. "Keep recording, Mrs. Jenkins. Don't stop." Eleanor's hand steadied, knowing this footage would likely become required viewing at the academy. Marshall had always said change needed documentation, proof that couldn't be denied or explained away. Thompson swaggered back from the patrol car, a smirk playing at his lips that Eleanor had seen too many times during her legal career. Well, he called out loudly enough for the growing crowd to hear. "Seems like your registration doesn't match the neighborhood, sir." The implied bias in his voice made Eleanor's jaw clench. Marshall's voice carried clearly across the morning air, measured and precise. "Officer, are you suggesting there's something unusual about a black man driving a Honda in the neighborhood where he grew up?" The question hung in the air like summer lightning, challenging and dangerous. Eleanor's phone buzzed with a private message from the governor's office. "Is that really him? We have his swearing-in ceremony in 3 days." She typed back quickly, "Yes, Mom." Watching history unfold right here on Maple Street. The growing crowd of neighbors had formed an informal semicircle around the scene. Mrs. Rodriguez clutched her rosary. Marcus and Keisha had been joined by 3 more neighborhood kids on bikes, and Mr. Johnson, a retired judge, stood in his driveway still in his church clothes, shaking his head in disbelief. For the record, Eleanor spoke into her phone, her lawyer's instincts kicking in. "Officer Thompson's body camera has been off this entire time, a direct violation of Department Policy Section 8.43, which, ironically, Dr. Marshall helped draft last year." Rivera's voice carried across the lawn, dripping with sarcasm. "Sir, if this is really your neighborhood, I'm sure you won't mind telling us where you're headed." The young officer's attempt at a gotcha moment was about to backfire spectacularly. Eleanor smiled, knowing exactly what was coming. She'd just left Catherine Marshall's house an hour ago, helping her prepare for Sunday dinner. The okra was already simmering on the stove, waiting for Jimmy to arrive with the fresh cornbread from Peterson's bakery. The live stream comments section had become a who's who of state law enforcement and political figures. Eleanor noticed the mayor had joined, along with 3 city council members and the head of the police union. The viewers weren't just watching a traffic stop anymore. They were witnessing a masterclass in exposing systemic bias. Marshall's phone began to ring and Eleanor recognized the custom ringtone he used for official calls. She steadied her camera, knowing the next few moments would be referenced in police training seminars for years to come. "Ladies and gentlemen," she whispered to her viewers, "watch closely. The tables are about to turn." The distinctive ringtone of Marshall's phone cut through the morning air, the official state government tone that his assistant had insisted he use for priority calls. Officer Thompson's face twisted with annoyance at the interruption of his power play. "Don't you dare answer that phone," he snapped, pointing an accusatory finger through the window. "Actually, officer," Marshall responded with the same calm he'd maintained throughout the encounter, "as I'm not under arrest, I'm well within my rights to answer this call, particularly since," he paused for effect, "it's from Governor Chen's office." He held up the phone's screen, displaying the official state seal and the governor's name. Thompson's face flickered between disbelief and dismissal. "Yeah, right, and I'm the Tooth Fairy." Rivera snickered, though there was a hint of uncertainty in his laughter now. The morning sun caught the stake medallion swinging from Marshall's rearview mirror, its official seal now clearly visible. Marshall pressed the speaker button, filling the air with the crisp, authoritative voice of Governor Sarah Chen. "James, where are you? We need to finalize the details for your swearing-in ceremony. The press is already asking about your plans to address department reform in your first 100 days as state police chief." The color drained from Thompson's face so rapidly that Eleanor Jenkins, still streaming from her porch, worried he might faint. Rivera's hand dropped from his holster as if it had suddenly become electrified. The only sound was the soft creak of Miss Eleanor's rocking chair and the distant church bells. "Good morning, Governor," Marshall replied, his voice carrying the weight of 28 years of law enforcement experience. "I apologize, but I'm currently being detained by Officers Thompson and Rivera. They seem particularly concerned about my presence in my childhood neighborhood." He paused, letting the implications sink in. "In fact, they've provided an excellent case study for our upcoming reform initiatives." The governor's voice sharpened. "Officers Thompson and Rivera. Are these the same officers who received commendations last month?" Through the speaker, papers could be heard shuffling. "James, aren't they from Precinct 6? The one where you're planning to launch the pilot program for community engagement training?" "The very same," Marshall confirmed, watching as Rivera slowly backed away from the car, realization dawning on his face. Thompson stood frozen, his earlier swagger replaced by a rigid terror. "Governor, would you mind holding for a moment?" I believe Officer Thompson was about to explain why he felt it necessary to conduct this stop with his body camera turned off. The growing crowd of neighbors had fallen completely silent. Marcus, the boy on his bicycle, whispered loudly to his sister, "Is that really the governor?" Keisha nodded, recording everything on her phone. "And that's the new police chief they've been talking about on TV." Thompson's mouth opened and closed several times, no words emerging. His hands, which had been so confidently positioned on his utility belt, now hung limply at his sides. The weight of his actions, and their consequences, seemed to physically press down on his shoulders. "Officers," the governor's voice cut through the silence. "I look forward to discussing this incident in detail during next week's Police Oversight Committee meeting. I'm particularly interested in hearing your interpretation of the department's body camera policies." The threat in her pleasant tone was unmistakable. Marshall reached into his jacket's inner pocket, causing both officers to flinch. Slowly, he withdrew his state police credentials, complete with the gold shield of his new office. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying none of the anger or vindictiveness they clearly feared, "I believe this concludes our traffic stop. However, I'd like both of you to join me tomorrow morning in my office. We clearly have some important matters to discuss regarding community policing." The credentials caught the sunlight, the gold badge gleaming like a spotlight on the officer's prejudices. Thompson's earlier words about the car not matching the neighborhood hung in the air like a damning testimony. Miss Eleanor's live stream counter had reached over 10,000 viewers. Among the comments, police chiefs from across the state were weighing in, some already requesting permission to use this footage for training purposes. The incident was transforming from a routine traffic stop into a watershed moment for police reform. Rather than immediately ending the encounter, Marshall made a decision that would later be studied in police academies nationwide. "Officers," he said, climbing out of his car with deliberate movements, "let's talk about what just happened here." His voice carried neither anger nor triumph, but the steady authority of a teacher seizing a vital learning moment. Thompson stood rooted to the spot, his earlier bravado replaced by a sickly pallor. Rivera had backed up against their patrol car, looking like he wished the ground would swallow him whole. The growing audience, including Miss Eleanor still streaming live, held their collective breath. "Walk me through your decision-making process," Marshall continued, assuming the role of instructor rather than victim. "Officer Thompson, let's start with the initial observation. You believed I rolled through the stop sign." He gestured toward his dashboard camera. "Would reviewing the footage help refresh your memory?" Thompson's mouth worked silently before he managed to stammer. "Sir, we didn't. I mean, you have to understand." Each incomplete sentence dug the hole deeper. The body camera he'd conveniently forgotten to activate now felt like a lead weight on his chest. "And Officer Rivera," Marshall turned his attention to the younger cop, whose face had taken on the expression of a freshman cadet during a surprise inspection. "I noticed your hand never left your weapon during our entire interaction. What specific actions of mine suggested I posed a threat?" Rivera's hand jerked away from his holster as if burned. "No, sir, it's just procedure. We're trained to." He trailed off, realizing how hollow his excuses sounded in the clear light of day. Marshall nodded thoughtfully. "Interesting, because I helped write those procedures, and nowhere do they state that an officer should maintain a threatening posture during a routine traffic stop." His words carried the weight of decades of experience on both sides of the badge. From her porch, Miss Eleanor's live stream had caught the attention of police departments across the state. Comments flooded in from chiefs, trainers, and officers, many recognizing this as a masterclass in accountability. The governor had stayed on the line, her presence on speakerphone adding an official weight to the proceedings. "Here's what I saw," Marshall continued, his voice carrying across the now silent street. "I saw 2 officers approach a vehicle with predetermined assumptions. I saw escalation without cause, intimidation without justification, and bias without awareness. Each point landed like a gentle hammer, constructive rather than crushing." Thompson's face had progressed through several shades of red before settling into a deep shame. "Chief, we had no idea who you were." The words tumbled out before he could stop them. "And that," Marshall replied, "is precisely the problem. Because this story would be equally unacceptable if I were a teacher, a doctor, or a sanitation worker. My title doesn't make this wrong. It merely makes it visible." The morning sun had climbed higher, casting shorter shadows across the scene. Marcus and the other neighborhood children watched wide-eyed as history unfolded on their quiet street. Mrs. Rodriguez had begun translating the exchange in whispers to her elderly mother, each word carrying the weight of decades of similar encounters. "Tomorrow morning, 9 a.m., my office," Marshall stated, not as a threat, but as an opportunity. "Bring your body camera footage, or rather, your explanation for its absence. We'll review this encounter in detail, not to punish, but to understand. Because, gentlemen," he paused, making eye contact with each officer, "this moment, this isn't the end of your careers. It's an opportunity to transform them." Governor Chen's voice crackled through the phone speaker. "Officers, I look forward to hearing how this experience shapes your perspectives on community policing. Chief Marshall has been advocating for a new approach to training. It seems you volunteered to be his first case study. The gravity of the situation, its implications, opportunities, and potential for change settled over the scene like a heavy blanket." Miss Eleanor's live stream counter ticked past 15,000 viewers, each one witnessing a masterclass in turning confrontation into education. Marshall reached into his car and retrieved the fresh cornbread he'd picked up for Sunday dinner. "Now, if you'll excuse me, gentlemen, my mother's waiting, and her okra waits for no one, not even the new state police chief." The emergency department meeting that afternoon transformed the austere conference room into an arena of uncomfortable truths. Every seat was filled, with officers standing along the walls, all eyes fixed on the large screen where Marshall stood, remote in hand. The room buzzed with whispers about the morning's incident, which had already gone viral thanks to Miss Eleanor's live stream. "Before we begin," Marshall addressed the room, his voice carrying the same calm authority it had maintained during the traffic stop, "I want to make something clear. This isn't about shame. This isn't about punishment. This is about growth." He gestured to Thompson and Rivera, who sat in the front row, looking like they hadn't slept in days despite only hours having passed. The screen behind him came to life, showing split-screen footage. His dashboard camera's view of the complete stop at the sign, alongside Miss Eleanor's live stream. "What you're about to see is not unique," Marshall continued. "What makes it unusual is not the incident itself, but the opportunity it presents for honest discussion." As the footage played, Marshall paused at key moments, breaking down each interaction with the precision of a forensic investigator. "Notice the approach angle," he commented, freezing on Thompson's aggressive stance. "What message does this body language send to a civilian?" "Lieutenant Rodriguez, your thoughts?" Rodriguez, a 20-year veteran, cleared his throat. "It's intimidating, sir, designed to establish dominance rather than ensure safety." The admission hung heavy in the air, several officers shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Marshall nodded, advancing to the next segment. "Now watch Officer Rivera's hand placement." The younger officer sank lower in his chair as his constant grip on his weapon became the focus. "Sergeant Chen, based on your training experience, what triggers this type of defensive posture?" "Fear, sir," Chen responded quietly. "But in this case, it seems the fear wasn't justified by any observable threat." The room grew still as the implications settled. As the footage continued, Marshall pulled up a split screen showing similar stops from his career, instances spanning decades where he'd been subjected to the same treatment. "This isn't about these two officers," he explained, his voice gentle but firm. "This is about patterns we've normalized, behaviors we've justified, and biases we've ignored." Thompson raised his hand, surprising everyone. His voice cracked as he spoke. "Chief, I need to say something." Marshall nodded encouragingly. "Watching it back like this, I don't recognize myself. Or maybe I do. And that's what scares me. We've been doing this so long, we stopped seeing what it looks like from the other side." Rivera joined in, his earlier bravado replaced by genuine reflection. "The way we talked about the neighborhood, about your car, we were writing a story in our heads before we even turned on the lights. A story based on nothing. But," he trailed off, unable to finish. "Based on bias," Marshall completed for him. "Unconscious or otherwise, it shaped every decision you made during that stop." He clicked to the next slide, showing statistics from similar encounters across the state. "You're not alone. But being unalone in this doesn't make it right." The presentation continued, but it had evolved from a disciplinary meeting into something more profound. Officers began sharing their own experiences, both as enforcers and recipients of these behaviors. Veterans admitted to training rookie officers in the same aggressive tactics. Younger officers spoke about feeling pressured to adopt a confrontational stance to fit in. "Tomorrow," Marshall announced as the session drew to a close, "we begin a new chapter. Every officer in this department will participate in a reformed training program. We'll review body camera footage not just for policy violations, but for opportunities to do better. We'll engage with the community not as occupiers, but as partners." He turned to Thompson and Rivera. "You two have a choice. This can be the moment that ends your careers, or the moment that transforms them. I'm offering you the chance to be part of the solution, to help train others by sharing your experience, to turn this morning's mistake into tomorrow's lesson." The room held its breath as the two officers exchanged glances. Thompson stood slowly, years of ingrained swagger replaced by genuine humility. "Chief," he said, his voice steady despite his obvious emotion, "I want to be part of the change. We both do." Marshall smiled, not in triumph but in hope. "Then let's get to work. Because, gentlemen, the hardest part isn't admitting the problem exists. The hardest part is being willing to be part of the solution." 1 year later, Officer Thompson stood before a packed auditorium at the National Police Reform Conference, his hand steady on the podium, despite the butterflies in his stomach. The audience, a mix of chiefs, trainers, and officers from across the country, waited in expectant silence. "A year ago," he began, his voice carrying to the back row. I was the officer who made headlines for harassing my own police chief during a traffic stop. Today, I'm here to tell you how that moment of shame became the catalyst for the most important transformation of my career. In the front row, Chief Marshal sat with Miss Eleanor Jenkins, both beaming with quiet pride. The dashcam footage from that Sunday morning had become required viewing at police academies nationwide, but it was Thompson's candid reflections that truly brought the lessons home. I thought I knew what good policing looked like. Thompson continued, clicking to a slide showing his confrontational stance from that day. I had the stance down, the authoritative voice, the intimidating presence. What I didn't have was understanding. What I didn't have was humanity. The presentation screen split to show two versions of Thompson, the aggressive officer from that morning and the community liaison he'd become. Recent footage showed him coaching youth basketball at the community center, leading implicit bias workshops, and most importantly, training other officers in what he called dignity-first policing. Rivera, now a dedicated youth mentor, sat with Marcus, the boy who'd watched the incident from his bicycle. The teenager had just been accepted into the department's cadet program, inspired by the changes he'd witnessed in his neighborhood. Officer Rivera taught me that real strength isn't about power, Marcus had written in his application essay. It's about understanding. We've stopped measuring success by the number of citations issued, Thompson explained, showing charts of the department's transformed metrics. Instead, we track positive community interactions, successful de-escalations, and most importantly, the growing trust between officers and the communities we serve. The statistics told a compelling story. Complaints down 60%, use of force incidents reduced by 70%, and community satisfaction ratings at an all-time high. But it was the personal stories that brought tears to eyes in the audience. Thompson played a clip of himself and Rivera teaching at the academy, using their own body camera footage as a teaching tool. Watch our assumptions cloud our judgment, they told the cadets. Watch how bias turns a simple traffic stop into a potential tragedy. Then watch how Chief Marshal showed us a better way. Miss Eleanor's original live stream had gained millions of views, spawning a nationwide conversation about police reform. But it was what happened after the cameras stopped rolling that truly changed hearts and minds. Every Sunday, Thompson revealed, drawing surprised murmurs from the audience, Officer Rivera and I joined Chief Marshal at his mother's house for dinner. He clicked to a photo of them around Catherine Marshall's table, plates of her famous okra gumbo in front of them. She taught us that understanding starts with breaking bread together. That change happens one conversation at a time. The screen showed a series of images, Thompson and Rivera at community meetings, cultural sensitivity training sessions, and youth outreach programs. Each photo represented another step in their journey from being part of the problem to becoming part of the solution. We didn't just change policies, Thompson concluded, his voice thick with emotion. We changed mindsets, starting with our own. He gestured to Chief Marshal. Our chief could have ended our careers that morning. Instead, he showed us what true leadership looks like. He taught us that the badge isn't about power. It's about service, understanding, and growth. As the applause thundered through the auditorium, Marshall made his way to the podium. The two men embraced, their journey from adversaries to allies captured in countless photos by the press. But it was the simple truth in Thompson's words that resonated most. Sometimes your worst moment can become your best teacher, if you're humble enough to learn from it. Outside the conference center, a new generation of officers lined up to hear their story. And back on Maple Street, where it all began, the community had transformed alongside its officers. The stop sign where Marshall had been pulled over now bore a small plaque, "Where change began, Sunday, November 29, 2024.